All right, we want to bring in Nicholas Burns. He's the former U.S. ambassador to NATO and Greece, and he's now a professor of international relations at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Thank you so much for joining us. We have an emergency meeting underway now in the United Nations. And, you know, here's something that has happened over and over again, that Russia and China block or veto any measures that may place some sort of restrictions on what's happening in Syria. Why does that continue to happen, and is there a way to stop it?
Well, the Russian government's protecting the Syrian government because they're aligned inside Syria. China does it because China doesn't want other countries to interfere in China's business. And so it's a nefarious duo. And frankly, this is, as you've just showed, horrific attacks. There's a reason why chemical weapons are outlawed in the Chemical Weapons Convention, because they do terrible, terrible damage, kill and maim civilians mostly. And so we've got to stand up, we the international community, to oppose this. And if Russia and China protect Bashar al-Assad at the United Nations, then they have to bear responsibility with him for these horrific crimes and atone for those crimes. Very important that the United States, Britain, and France, the three permanent members, stand up today to force Russia and China to speak about what happened.
And yet, Ambassador, we've got top U.S. diplomats like Ambassador Nikki Haley and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson saying the Syrian people should decide President Bashar al-Assad's fate, and that it's not America's priority or focus to remove him from power. And as Major Garrett reported here on this network, and others have posited these claims, or this idea that the President of the United States and his diplomats are going to be looking more towards this country and less with policing the world. Does that give a license to Bashar al-Assad to do some of the things that he's being accused of doing?
I don't think it gives a license. I would not blame Secretary Tillerson or Ambassador Haley. They're not to blame for this. Assad is to blame for it. And the Iranians and the Russians who work with him on the ground in Syria are complicit in this. I think it was probably unwise for the United States to say we're no longer focused on the removal of Assad. I think everyone knows the United States has in effect withdrawn from Syria for the most part in terms of the internal politics of Syria and the civil war, that we're mostly focused on the fight against the Islamic State. But I think in announcing that, you somehow let Assad off the hook, but it doesn't mean that it would be unfair to say that the Trump administration has any kind of responsibility. It certainly doesn't for this. At the same time, I would say this: the Trump administration has to be very careful where they assign blame. President Trump himself blamed President Obama. That's cowardly to blame your predecessor. And President Trump has to take ownership over the U.S. Syria policy now, and that ought to be focused on a tough-nosed attitude towards Assad, but also the Russians and the Iranians.
Yeah, President Trump and other critics of the Obama administration often bring up what President Obama said, which was that the use of chemical weapons was a red line that should not be crossed, and there would be repercussions. And of course, there were no repercussions. In 2013, when there was another chemical attack, it was Russia that eventually ended up brokering a deal with Assad to what was supposed to be to get rid of all of the chemical weapons and all of the ingredients that could make chemical weapons.
Which hasn't happened.
Clearly,
right.
That hasn't happened. But I'm wondering, should we revisit this idea of a red line, and how would that be enforceable the way things stand today, especially with Russia being so active in Syria? And we heard Russia's explanation for this chemical attack. Russia basically said, you know, Assad had nothing to do with it. It was actually the rebels.
Well, we cannot trust what the Russians say because they lie routinely to their public and to our public. And you certainly can't trust what the Assad government says. All the experts have been saying that the only military with the capacity to use this type of weapon, if it was indeed sarin gas, would be the Syrian Air Force. If you set a red line, then you have to be determined to back it up. And that was President Obama's mistake, in my judgment, back in 2013 when he didn't back it up. And clearly the agreement between the United States, Russia, and Syria that Syria would withdraw all of it, give up all of its chemical weapons. Well, the Syrian government cheated because they've now used chemical weapons several times against their civilian population, including notoriously yesterday. So the United States now has to figure out how deeply engaged do we wish to be on this issue. And if you set red lines, then you're really committing the United States to use force. That's a big decision. You'd have to have the capacity to carry out a threat that would ostensibly mean bombing the air force of the Syrian government to prevent it from using its air force to deploy chemical weapons in the future. I don't think the Trump administration is there. And what we have not heard from President Trump or his lieutenants in the government is, what is the strategy in Syria? President Trump did flirt with the idea of aligning with Putin against the Islamic State. That's the last thing we should do now, because Putin and the Russian government have blood on their hands. And there are going to be war crimes charges by some in Europe against the Assad government for what happened yesterday.
So, Ambassador Burns, if the United States does not do anything, game this out for us. What does it look like in Syria a year from now, 2 years from now?
The situation is as bad as it could possibly be. There are about 22.5 million Syrians in the country. There were at the beginning of the revolution 6 years ago. The United Nations now thinks that more than 12 million of those 22.4 million people are homeless, 7 million inside the country, 5 million outside the country. So the United States can do one thing here. Absent the deployment of military force, we can take in refugees. We can open our doors and do what Americans have always done for many decades, take in people from the worst conflict zones. But the Trump administration has cut off all refugee admissions to the United States, suspended them for a period of 4 months, and it could go longer than that. I think that's immoral at a time when there's such huge suffering. This is the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world since 1945, and we aren't doing anything to help those Syrian refugees. I would hope the Trump administration would reconsider this very, very faulty refugee policy.
Well, some heated discussions going on at the UN today. We will see if we get a hint of a policy towards Syria at some point, because right now we're just sort of relying on statements and tweets, and we really don't know what the hardcore policy from this administration is. Ambassador Nicholas Burns, thank you so much.
Thank you.